I was in first grade, and it was a big scare to America that, we thought we were ahead in everything technologically over the Russians, and there was no notion of a space race at that time. But America was trying to send up satellites, and we kept having, rockets blow up on the launch pad all the time. Lots and lots of failures, very public. The Soviet Union launched this thing, and they got a satellite in orbit long before we did, and this scared everybody because they suddenly realized, oh my goodness, we've got H-bombs, they've got H-bombs, but they can launch them from space, and we'll have no warning and no defense against them, and they hate us and we hate them. And so it was a big shakeup in the Cold War. And somebody somewhere decided that this is a fault of our educational system, that these Russians are smarter than we are. And so they figured, Ivan can do math and science, Johnny can't. We better fix this. And so my education after that basically got warped by that event. So everybody who could do math or science was expected to do math or science because it was the nation's survival depended on our ability to compete with the Russians and catch up and win the space race. And so I was in some sort of experimental math and science program for the next 12 years, all the way up through high school graduation every year. And if I wanted to be an architect, which crossed my mind a few times, it seemed wrong for me to do so because I felt I had an obligation to go do math and science to help win the space race and keep the Russians from bombing us into dust. In society at large, there was a big fear, the fear of nuclear war went up even higher than it had been, and so people started building bomb shelters and things like that. And the Cold War was considered to be really, really intense and tight then because what had thought to be U.S. military superiority was no longer seen that way. There was lots of talk about missile gaps, do they have more weapons than we do, and lots of strange things. So it did change public conversations, it changed public concern, it changed what politicians talked about. How much it changed daily life for everybody else, I couldn't say. But, we went through drills where you had to duck and cover in case the nuclear bombs were coming. And I was given dog tags to wear so that they could identify my remains after the nuclear war, because I was living on an Air Force base, things like that. So there were lots of little things like that that you could point to that people today wouldn't recognize. My dad was flying in B-47 Stratojets, carrying the nuclear weapons. And it was his belief that it was another waste of time. That with luck, his mission basically was to keep war from happening. He was supposed to be such a terrifying threat to the Russians that they wouldn't dare do anything wrong. The whole idea of mutual assured destruction is what they called it at the time, that if we each know that neither side will survive the war, then neither side will start the war. And crazy as it sounds, it actually seemed to have worked because we never had the war. But his belief was that that was the best thing to do, and that if the war actually came, there was no point messing around with bomb shelters and such, that it wouldn't matter.
So,
as I grew up, it seemed normal. I mean, that's the way it was in my life. It didn't seem an odd thing that there was this threat of destruction. My whole life had been that way. So we didn't have a change in which suddenly that came about, and I had a chance to evaluate and say, wow, this is a big change, this is different, we shouldn't be this way. It just sort of was the way it always was. And so you sort of adapt and learn and accept it because it's how it is.
so
That was a particularly scary thing for me because my dad was in the Air Force, and we were in Florida, 90 miles from Cuba, at the Air Force base there. And he was on alert, ready to go bomb Cuba. And I was in school, wondering if my dad was going to come back, and wondering if we were going to get blown up by the Cubans using their Russian missiles. And so that was a big, big deal. Everybody who was around at the time remembers the tensions. We got incredibly close to nuclear war at the time, and perhaps never matched since then. That one of our assignments was in Florida, and that's where we were at the time of the crisis. So we were clearly in range of the missiles, and my dad was clearly in range of Cuba with his bomber. And so I didn't see much of him during that time because he was off on alert. I don't know that fear is quite the right word. It was more just a huge anxiety and doubt and lack of understanding as to how we got there, what was going on, and why. I didn't have any control over it at the time. Just sort of felt it was happening around me. It's kind of like terrible weather comes, and you find yourself in that environment, you don't exactly know why or how, and there's nothing you can do about it, you just have to get through it. that's one of I referred to this sort of thing earlier today as kind of a Pearl Harbor moment. You know, it's clearly one of those things where everybody who was around at the time remembers it when they heard what was going on, what they were doing. It's one of those things, that sort of frozen moment kind of deals. And it was a staggering thing for me to have a president assassinated. I didn't comprehend it. I thought assassinations were things that happened way back in the distant past, not something that could happen to me in my life today. It was as if, you know, you'd heard on the news that somebody had been devoured by bears. I mean, it just doesn't happen anymore. You know, we don't have to worry about wild animal attacks like you did, you know, thousands of years ago. It's not caveman style life, and assassinations were something that happened way back in history, not something that happens currently. And I was stunned to find, you know, to discover he'd actually been killed, and really quite amazed at it. And I remember exactly where I was standing when I heard the news, and it shook up everybody. The whole country was just came to a standstill for about a week.
So what were you doing during that moment?
I was in the library, reaching up on a shelf to take down a book. I was trying to decide what I wanted to read, and there was a classic up there called Of Human Bondage by Somerset Maugham. And I had it halfway pulled out, and it came on the PA system and announced that the president had been assassinated. And I pushed the book back and just sort of sat and thought about that. What the heck is this? What does it mean? What's going on? And I never have read that book.
Wow.
Never went back to it.
So they just like announced the president has been assassinated?
Yeah, it's like the announcements come on right now. You know, they say, excuse the interruption, but, you know, golf practice is canceled today. You know, they say, you know, excuse the interruption, President Kennedy has been shot. He died at, you know, 2:17 Dallas time, or whatever it was, you know, that sort of thing. All right. You're kidding. No, it can't. Yeah, it was just same way they, you know, announce some event here on campus. That's how it was for me. I was in the school library at the time. It shook up everybody's confidence in the future. Kennedy had come in with, you know, sweeping notions of optimism and hope for the future, and change and progress and all that sort of stuff. And he made grand plans for everybody. Look, we're going to land a man on the moon. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. You know, all these great things. And suddenly he was gone, and people were in real fear as to what that meant. You know, what would become of us now that symbol of hope had suddenly been killed. The very notion that that sort of lawlessness would take place, and that power can shift not from the ballot box but from violence that way, it's incredibly disruptive. And so I think the fact that he was popular, and, you know, he was quite the glamour guy at the time, I know that it had some influence on it, but I don't think it matters. If he'd been somebody who wasn't glamorous, more like Richard Nixon, if he'd been assassinated, it still would have been a shock to the nation. A very, very big one at that. It was a staggering achievement of the 20th century, I think. And as we were talking before you started filming, everybody watched it, everybody knew about it. Everybody had their mind on the moon while it was going on, and everybody was amazed when it happened. I remember watching some of it on TV and then stepping out in my front yard and looking up at the moon and looking up and saying, there are people up there walking there right now. It was a really cool thing. Well, I thought it had made a big change in people's view of the nation's capacity. If we really picked a course and knuckled down and pulled together in the same direction, that just about anything seemed possible. Landing on the moon was considered until then the definition of the impossible task. I've tried many times to come up with an example for your generation, and I can't. And the closest I come up with is like inventing time travel. Yeah, you know, like how likely is that, right? You know, if you want to describe something that's utterly impossible, tell somebody, oh, go do something. What are you going to tell them? You know, and those people say, yeah, right, fly to the moon, that sort of thing. It was not possible. It wouldn't happen. It could never happen. It was the stuff of stories and myths and things, and people joked about the moon being made of green cheese and things like that. But no one ever really seriously considered what it would mean to be there. And we managed to pull it off. And it changed everybody's view of what we could or should be doing and why we were doing it. And it led to people, you know, phrases that hadn't shown up before. People would say, well, if we can put a man on the moon, then we can, and you fill in the blank from there. So no matter what it was, no matter how hard it seemed, you know, it seemed it couldn't be as hard as what we'd just done. And so it brought about a sense of accomplishment, a sense of optimism again as to what Americans could do if they really set their minds to it, if they really wanted. We ought to be able to accomplish anything. It was shocking to everybody everywhere. On my campus, I was not at Kent State, but we all heard about it, and so campuses all over the country went basically on strike in protest, in solidarity with the students there. There's a song by Crosby, Stills and Nash, which is a group you've never heard of, but they were very, very big at the time, called Ohio, about it. The lyric goes something like, tin soldiers and Nixon's coming, we're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, 4 dead in Ohio. And it was a big rallying point for everybody who was anti-war, and it turned many people anti-government as well. There were people from the community who were interviewed, and this one guy said, "Oh, it should have been done a long time ago." Like, students deserve to be shot for disagreeing with the government. And lots of flashpoint sound bites like that flying around. On my campus, people stopped going to class. The university was basically completely stalled where it was. The students occupied the student union building thinking it was theirs, it was a place for protest. Turns out it doesn't belong to the students, it belongs to the regents of the university, and the regents didn't want that, so they called and had the state police come in. And the state police were doing a good job. They understood the nature of civil disobedience, so they were carrying people out peacefully, say, "Hi, we got to take you out," and the people who were protesters understood, there was no violence, no hatred, and the protesters were putting flowers in the gun barrels of the police, which was a common statement at the time, to respond to violence with peace was the idea. They're all being carried out. I was not yet caught up in the protests. I was actually on campus playing tennis, and I was looking for something to drink, and so I went over to the student union figuring I could get, an orange soda or something there. And I walked in the middle and realized, oh, this is the occupation, and here are the police. And so the police are carrying everybody out, so I figured, there I am in my, people wore white shorts in those days for tennis. I had my tennis whites on and carried my racket. Okay, so I leave with the police. And about that time, the National Guard came through. The National Guard apparently had been called out by the governor. I don't know who else has the authority to do it. And they were wearing gas masks, and they had their name tapes taped over so you couldn't identify any of them. They had fixed bayonets, and they swept through the crowd, and they bayoneted a whole bunch of people, including the editor of the campus paper and an NBC cameraman who spent weeks in intensive care. That got to be a big deal locally. After all this came out, there was a trial eventually. They couldn't identify any of the people who'd done the bayoneting because of the gas masks and the tape. The general who was in charge of the National Guard claimed, we didn't really bayonet anybody. They must have just fallen in the rose bushes. One of the guys lost a lung. You don't lose that from thorns on rose bushes. So there was lying and cheating and deceit all over the place on the government side, and that just galvanized people even more. And so we became another rallying point for protests. Jane Fonda came to campus and gave a big speech. I got to stand at a barricade with her and meet Jane Fonda, which was very impressive for a college kid at the time. She was quite the celebrity then. But what it did for me and for people of my age is we became more fearful of our own government than we were of the North Vietnamese. We were messing with, why were we going over there to put ourselves in harm's way to deal with Vietnam? The real threat to us seemed to be our own government. It was the National Guard that shot us. It wasn't Vietnamese who had invaded America who were shooting at us. It was actually our own people, our own authorities, who were calling out violence against us while we were trying to protest peacefully. And for many people of my age, it radicalized us. It made us distrust government ever after, and to become much more pacifist in our views than we would have been any other way, because we saw the result of violence just against dissent and the result of violence otherwise. I had friends that year who had been drafted and gone off to Vietnam, and several of them never came back. I had a couple of friends who were helicopter pilots who were shot down and killed, and I know other people who came back who were maimed. I know one guy who walks with a limp and has an eye patch because he had half his leg blown off and lost an eye there, still got some shrapnel in his body, and people whose lives were really warped by all that. And so it's a very emotional thing for people of my age. There's still big gulfs between those who volunteered and served and those who didn't. When the soldiers came back from Vietnam, they were not treated well. People thought of them as evildoers rather than people who were serving And so there's been a huge gap between people of my generation ever since. Some of that's been healed by the way the Afghan and Iraqi veterans have been treated, but some of it not. And there's still, people still have chips on their shoulders one way or the other, depending on which side of the dispute they were on. But I thought it was a watershed in American social life that we reached a point where we had the military firing on its own people. And it's incredibly memorable for anybody who was of college age or older at the time. That's really stands out, and in particular for me because I saw those bayonets up close. When people are in power, you watch very, very closely and don't take what they say without a whole lot of salt. And you look behind it for secondary motives, for things like that. And you just, when I was much younger, you know, I knew what government was doing. I thought they were open about things, and I learned quickly that that wasn't the case.